think so. Good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the second of our lecture series, Books, Prose, and the Course of Modern History with the incomparable Professor Stephen Berk. As you know, the freedom to read is under assault in the United States, particularly in public schools, which are curtailing students' freedom to explore words, ideas, and books. In the 2022-23 school year, from July 1st, 2022 to June 31st, 2023, 3,362 instances of book bans in U.S. public schools, classrooms, and libraries occurred. These bans removed student access to 1,557 unique book titles and the works of over 1,400 authors. So it's a very important topic that we have this evening, which is focusing on books in the United States. I know that you all know Dr. Berk, but just let me remind you that he is the professor of history at Union College and the holder of the Henry and Sally Schaefer Chair of Holocaust and Jewish Studies, and he's the recipient of the Florence B. Sherwood Chair in History and Culture and a consultant to the Wiesenthal Holocaust Center. He has many, many accolades and contributions to the landscape of the academic landscape of our community and to our nation and to the world, and it's really my pleasure to introduce him tonight. And I should also just say, my name's Amy Posner. I'm the chair of the Adult Education Committee here at Agud Vachim. And with that note, if you would please silence your phones, and without further ado, Dr. Berk.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for those who are watching on Zoom, and thanks for those in Long Island. Thank you very, very much. I've been asked before I begin to tell you that there's going to be a speaker at the Open Door Bookstore. Steve Shanken from Saratoga is going to speak about the book that he wrote, Impossible Escape, about someone who escaped from Auschwitz, a Jewish fellow that escaped from Auschwitz. That is Sunday, October 15th, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Today is October 5th. I cannot let it go. I cannot let it go. It's one of my students, so I gotta be nice. I cannot let it go. Tomorrow will be the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, a war that changed so much. And so I'm going to allocate some time, not much, to talk about what is called the Yom Kippur War, or the War of Ramadan, that's how the Arabs see it, or the October War. Now, that war sheds light on a number of things, about leadership, about hubris, about the American people, and about the failure of intelligence. I have not seen the film Golda, but I have read about it, and I know what the story is about, and I've spoken to people who have seen the film. The film, from what I gather, has done a fairly good job, if not exonerating Golda for her behavior in the Yom Kippur War, has certainly mitigated the charges against her. But I must tell you that in Israel, unless further evidence, really conclusive evidence, is forthcoming, Golda will not be looked upon very, very nicely in the state of Israel. Now, I have to be very careful in what I am saying. It's really a nuanced argument, and again, this is not mathematics or science. You cannot say A plus B produces C. You simply cannot do it. Golda was the prime minister at the time. She was also the prime minister in an earlier period of time, 3 years earlier, when Anwar Sadat, the leader after Nasser of Egypt, made a proposal. The proposal was that Israel should withdraw a certain number of miles from the Suez Canal and that an armistice would ensue. Golda rejected that, probably with the support of the overwhelming majority of Israelis, in saying that what we want is not an armistice, not a truce, we want a peace agreement. Did she make a mistake? Did Israel make a mistake in that period of time? Again, historians will judge it. As of now, most historians do say that it was a mistake. In addition to that, in fairness to Golda, she received intelligence information from many people, particularly in military intelligence, that the Arabs were not going to attack. What happened in late September is the Arabs mobilized, moved troops in the direction of the Suez Canal, and pulled back. They did this at least twice. And the argument of people in Israel, in high places, was that the Egyptians, knowing that the Israeli army is a citizen army and would have to draw upon reserves, was doing this to weaken the Israeli economy. But no attack was forthcoming. But on the other hand, Israel had a very, very good spy, probably the second most important spy that Israel has ever had. The most important was Eli Cohen, who was a spy in Syria. Some of you may have seen the documentary or the docudrama about him. It is on Netflix or Prime. It's really a very good one. But this one was the son-in-law of Nasser. And this one really had entree into the highest echelons of Egyptian society. And he was telling people in the Mossad, it's coming, and it's coming very soon. That information was, if not disregarded, it was minimized. Now, that's the basic problem of intelligence. You get information that tells you one thing is going to happen, and then there's a pile of information on the other side that tells you something else. That, incidentally, for those of you who know your modern American history, that was the problem in early December of 1941, when there was information that was leading to a conclusion that the Japanese were going to attack, not necessarily Pearl Harbor, but in the Philippines. And then there was other information that said that they weren't going to attack. In the end, we did not pay much attention to it, and the attack took place. But again, remember what Harry Truman said? The buck stops here, right? She is the prime minister. And I must tell you, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. My roommates were always in the Wharton School, the business school, the famous business school. And what they drummed into them at the Wharton School was, I remember because I use it sometimes when I tell my students, is that you can delegate authority, but you can never delegate responsibility. In the end, she was the prime minister. And when she was asked by the head of the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, that the information looks pretty grim, and this is on the morning of October 6th, we've got to launch a preemptive attack that will give us precious time. But again, I want to be fair to Golda. Golda was being told by President Nixon and by the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, don't launch a preemptive attack. You will not get our support. But again, she's not the President of the United States, she's the Prime Minister of Israel. She is responsible. In fact, it's her decision to make. She chose to make the wrong decision. And what is also, this time not also, but was inexcusable, is what the Israeli armed forces were not prepared. They ran short of lots of things. And people in Israel would argue there was no excuse for that. She was the prime minister. The war revealed some other things as well. It tells you how dangerous hubris can be. One of the better books on the Israeli-Arab conflict was written by a man who is not Jewish. The book is dated. He wrote it in 1988. That's a man, if you took English courses, you always read him because he was a very prominent Irish literary critic, Conor Cruz O'Brien. And his book is called The Siege. It's very good, but it's, of course, because it's in 1988, it's dated. And what he said, he had a good way of putting it, after the Six-Day War, the birds of hubris fled from their nests in Damascus and in Cairo and in Baghdad, and they landed and built new nests in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. In short, what existed really in the aftermath of the Six-Day War was a belief on the part of the Israelis that the Arabs neither have the guts or the courage or the ability to launch an attack. Now, I don't know if you remember, if the older people in the room will remember, the aftermath of the Six-Day War. On American television, everybody was poking fun at the Arabs. The Arabs really performed abysmally, the Egyptian army. And there were pictures, if you remember, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, of Arab soldiers taking their shoes off by the thousands and running in the desert trying to escape Israeli captivity. The Arabs didn't look very, very well in the Six-Day War, and the belief in Israel was that, again, they had neither the courage nor the ability to launch an attack. Now, to give you an idea of what the hubris meant, the Israelis built a line of fortifications on the eastern side of the Suez Canal. The line of fortifications was named after a general, General Bar-Lev. It was called the Bar-Lev Line. There were less than 1,000 Israeli soldiers entrenched in the Bar-Lev Line. When the crunch came at 2:30 in the afternoon, there were at least 60,000 Arabs that crossed. There was no way in the world, no matter how brave, no matter how entrenched those Israeli soldiers would be, that they could in fact stand against the Egyptians. And it was believed that the Syrians would really not launch an attack. But the fact of the matter was they did. And they almost came to Haifa. They were not far from Haifa when they were stopped by an Israeli tank counterattack. If you want to see, again, I think I told some of you, my friends, I've told some of you this. I never thought when I started to teach that I would ever tell students to watch television. I never thought I would do that. Now there is such good stuff on television, on the streaming channels, that I have to tell them to watch. There's a lot of stuff on World War II. I teach a course on World War II. I teach on the Holocaust. But there is a magnificent series on HBO Max. It's very hard to take, and that is The Valley of Tears, which is the first 2 or 3 days on the Golan Heights. It is very, very good. Tough to take, because the first 3 days were really not very good for Israel and the casualties mounted. The Israeli casualties, if I didn't mention them before, 2,556 dead, 7,200 wounded. In terms of the dead, if you put it on a proportionate basis, in 3 weeks' time, Israel lost 3 times as many men, that's proportionately now, 3 times as many men in 3 weeks that the United States lost in 15 years of fighting in Vietnam. So for a small country with a small population, this left an indelible imprint on the Israeli psyche. Also, you see the importance of the United States, and you see realpolitik here. I'm not speaking out of school, as they say. I'm not making an unfortunate statement. It's an unfortunate statement, but it's not a lying statement. It's not deceitful. Richard Nixon was no friend of ours. Richard Nixon was, by no stretch of the imagination, could you call him a philo-Semite. What you see, we got from all the tapes, remember, that we got to listen to, Richard Nixon did not like Jews. But yet in the middle of October, Richard Nixon acquiesced to proposals by our defense, Secretary of Defense, and by Henry Kissinger, that we have to resupply the Israelis. Without that resupply, Israel was done, or at least it would be in very, very bad shape. So why did Nixon, the anti-Semite, rally to the defense of the Jewish state? Once again, it was not a burst of philo-Semitism, that's for sure. He is reputed to have said, when asked a question like I just asked, he answered very simply, their guys were beating our guys. That is, Egypt and Syria, protégés of the Soviet Union, were beating our protégé, the State of Israel. If the United States did not come to the support of Israel, every American alliance system would go down the tubes. Who would trust the United States and NATO if they're not coming to the defense of Israel, a long-standing ally? Who would they come? Would they come to the defense of us? Nick, that's realpolitik. That is, you might not like a group of people, but in fact your national interest is involved, again, you have to play the game. For those of you who would like me to bring this up right to the contemporary, of course, you see President Biden's behavior in dealing with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. That is, remember, All the evidence indicates that he ordered the execution of that journalist Khashoggi. He ordered it. There's no question about that. And Khashoggi was not only murdered, he was dismembered. It was a horrible killing. And you remember President Biden saying, and the American Congress, particularly the Democratic Party, saying, this is terrible, this is an outlaw, a renegade country, bum, bum, bum. And then he goes to Saudi Arabia, shakes MBS's hand, and everything is all good. And the answer, the reason for that is the Saudis have the oil. They play a major role in regulating oil prices in the international scene. So what do you have to do? I'll use the language of my students. You got to suck it up. That's what you got to do, and you got to do it. It happens again and again and again. And I myself, I must tell you, feel somewhat the same way. Again, I'm not going to give you a lecture on what is happening in the Ukraine, but any Jew, Jewish man or woman, who has even the most cursory knowledge of Jewish history knows that the Ukraine runs with Jewish blood. Pogroms in 1648, the Khmelnytsky pogroms. If the Holocaust did not take place, the Ukrainian massacres of Jews between 1918 and 1920 would be the greatest destruction of the Jewish community in the modern period. And massive collaboration with the Nazis in the period 1941 to 1945. So I know that, but in the end, the Ukraine has to be defended. It must be defended. One, again, with all of my qualms about this and all my knowledge of Jewish history there, the fact of the matter is what Putin did is illegal, immoral, a violation of the international order, and as everyone should know, and that is the man who is watching the Ukraine more closely than anybody else is President Xi of China. If the United States would default on supporting the Ukraine, this you can take to the bank, President Xi will launch an invasion of Taiwan. These are things that you just have to do. So, and the last thing I will say about the October War, the Yom Kippur War, is it's not going to sound very good, and some of you may doubt what I'm about to say to you. But the Yom Kippur demonstrated, the war, in the aftermath of the war, demonstrated the intrinsic decency of the overwhelming majority of the American people, and again, only an idiot would deny the existence of anti-Semitism in American society. We have had too many testimonies to the fact that it's taken place, and a number of Jews have died as a result of white supremacy and white nationalism and so on. But if ever there was a time, now I address myself to the people of the long memory, the mature people in the room, and that is, if you have the long memory, you remember what it was in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War with the Arab oil embargo, and how we lined up on alternate days to get gasoline, and the price of gasoline rose very, very high. It could have been very easy, and I'm sure there were people in our country who were saying, it's the Jews who are responsible for this. It's the Jews and the state of Israel. That did not surface. That was a time when large numbers of Americans conceivably could have turned against the Jews, and they did not do so. It gives me hope for the future. Once again, one cannot deny the existence of anti-Semitism in American society. I've said this to some of you before. I'm paraphrasing Plato. Plato said, only the dead have seen the last of war. I'm telling you that only dead Jews have seen the last of anti-Semitism. But that will be here till the end of our time, the end of our children's time, end of our grandchildren's time. It will be here. The issue always is not whether or not anti-Semitism exists. It always exists. It will always exist. And the reason for that is there's an intellectual coherency to anti-Semitism that is not an oxymoron, what I just said to you. There's an intellectual coherency to anti-Semitism. The intellectual coherency of anti-Semitism is the ability of anti-Semitism to explain multi-causal phenomena in a monocausal way. I will say that again. The intellectual coherency of anti-Semitism is the ability of anti-Semitism to explain multi-causal phenomena in a monocausal way. Why did we lose the war? The Jews stabbed us in the back. Why is there a depression? The Jews did it. Why? What happened in 2008? The Great Recession? The Jews did it. And the proof, of course, look at this man Madoff, he's a Jew. The Germans played it up, even in our own country. The man who plays it up more than anybody else, probably the most effective anti-Semite in the United States, the smartest and the most articulate, are not some of these yolts in the white supremacist movement is Reverend Farrakhan. Reverend Farrakhan is the most articulate anti-Semite in our country, and he plays on this. The Jews are responsible for narcotics. The Jews are responsible for AIDS. The Jews are responsible for the slave trade, and so on. So anti-Semitism will be here till the end of time, even in our own country, but the issue is not whether it exists or not. The issue is the magnitude. Does it exist in a magnitude large enough to threaten us with physical violence and to impede our entrance into American society and into the highest echelons of American society? And I would argue, since the 1930s, you are hard-pressed to make the case that it really has reached that magnitude. Remember, it's not that long ago when there were 3 Jews on the Supreme Court of the United States. 1/3 of the Supreme Court were Jews. And of course, if our co-religionists and our compatriots had learned to cast their votes in the right way in Florida in 2000, we would have had a Jewish vice president. So, again, the Yom Kippur War demonstrates a number of very, very interesting things. Now let's get to the material at home, right? And that is to talk about, I will begin with John Locke. John Locke was not an American. But John Locke's influence upon American history is absolutely tremendous. And probably, together with the African American community, nobody has benefited from John Locke more than the American Jewry. For Locke did have said a number of things. Remember, we are all prisoners of our, not prisoners, we are all part of our time. If I tell you that Locke appeared in the second half of the 17th century, now, if you were my students, I would ask you, what's the significance of that? But you are not my students, so you'll be spared what I do to my students, which is to walk down right there, stand next to one student and say, what am I talking about? The mid-7th, the last part of the 17th century. And the student would give me at all ranges. It's from the sophisticated well to the unsophisticated duh. But when I stand next to the student, I get an immediate rise in the IQ. I can get 30 points. It doesn't last for more than 10 seconds, but you know what? It's all right. You can get something in 10 seconds. What is significant in the second half of the 17th century, this is the time of Isaac Newton. This is the time of the scientific revolution. This is a time, the Germans have a good word for it, Weltanschauung, a worldview. The worldview changes. It's not chaos out there. It's not randomness. The universe is governed by laws, and we can use the scientific method and reason to really understand those laws. Reason is important. Experimentation is important. The scientific method is important. All of these things are important. Now, again, I know we were all sophisticated people, but just to make the point, it amazes me that when I say this to some of my students, they don't know what I'm talking about, and that is, of course, every action has an opposite and equal reaction, right? The body in rest stays in rest, the body in motion stays in motion. And I tell them a good physics class in the first day, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. The worldview is there, these are laws, and you can discover them by the use of reason experimentation. It's not a giant step from there to say that if we use our reason, maybe we can understand our social and economic and political laws. In other words, we are moving from the age of reason to the Enlightenment. And the bottom line of the Enlightenment is that everything must be subjected to the light of reason. That which does not conform to reason must be rejected. So religion comes under the gun, and so too does that prevailing political principle that has existed for almost 2 millennia, and that is the idea of the divine right of kings. The argument is going to be that we are cursed by initial depravity. In Adam's fall, we sinned all, the idea of original sin, and God in his infinite mercy have placed kings and queens and bishops and cardinals and popes above us. Hobbes, a man, a contemporary of Locke, said it really wasn't like that. And he hinted that maybe people chose someone to rule over them. It's Locke who drives the locomotive right through. It is Locke who says, in a distant time when life was difficult, men chose either from within or from without, someone to rule over them. And they struck a deal with that man. And the deal was, you defend us in times of war, feed us in times of famine, adjudicate our disputes fairly, and we will give you a monopoly of political power. With more than one stroke of the pen, because he writes this in the two treatises and other things, he has demolished the prevailing form of government. That is, the king who governs you does not govern you by the grace of God. The king who governs you because he was chosen in an earlier period of time. Linked with that idea, Locke goes on to say that any government, no matter what type of government it is, any government draws its sovereignty from the will of the people. That it is the people who are the final arbiters on the legitimacy of a government. Again, it's not God, it's the people who give sovereignty. And then, if he drove the locomotive, now he drives the locomotive 1,000 miles. He says, since it is not God who has put the king upon us, and the king draws his legitimacy, his sovereignty from the people, if the king is not acting properly, the people have the right to dispense with him. I'll say that again. That's the idea of the social contract. If the king is not operating properly, not morally, not ethically, not legally, if he is abusing his citizens, his subjects, then the people have the right to overthrow him. Now, you know what I tell my students when I talk to them about this? I said, you all learn this in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades. And they shake their heads and they say, they didn't. Then I give them a further hint. I said, you all learn this in elementary school a little bit before school closed. That is in the second half of June. You always learn that. And the reason you learned that in the second half of June is because we were coming on July 4th, a day commemorating the Declaration of Independence. If you haven't ever read it, read the Declaration of Independence, read the preamble, and that's John Locke that's talking. Because what you get in the Declaration or the preamble to the Declaration are all of the abuses of King George III. He is taxing us without representation. He is stationing soldiers in our homes, one right after the other. That's John Locke, and the revolution is the idea of the social contract. But Locke even goes beyond that. Locke challenges Hobbes on the issue of religious heterogeneity and religious homogeneity. Hobbes said, if society is to be stable, there must be one religion. He wasn't concerned which religion it would be, but there had to be one religion. He has some I wouldn't say empirical validity for this, but this is what other people had thought. A good deal behind the Spanish Inquisition, behind rooting out heretics as they thought were heretics, was they wanted religious uniformity. They wanted everybody, the Muslims and Jews, either to be expelled. Muslims eventually will be expelled somewhat later. They wanted them all to become Catholics. That would really guarantee the stability and the survival of Ferdinand and Isabella's realm. For those of you that like, here's Mishkalov, my German friend, she'll correct my German, and that is, the Nazis used to say, ein Volk, ein Deutschland, ein Führer. One people, one nation, and one Führer. A desire for religious uniformity and national, and in the Nazi case, racial uniformity. So, that's what Hobbes is saying. He's not concerned with race. He's talking about religious uniformity. But Hobbes says that's a crock. That's just not right. In fact, every individual, Hobbes said, Locke said, every individual is given by God. He was a believer. This is a man. He may not have believed in the divine right of kings, but he believed in God. God has given certain inalienable rights. That idea again in the Declaration. That idea of inalienable rights. That comes from John Locke. And one of the inalienable rights we have is the right we have given reason and intellectual ability, and we have the right to choose our way to salvation. A state does not have the right to intervene and force people to decide which way they will approach God. That's John Locke. And that's not in the Constitution. Again, I'll ask the question, but because we want to finish before Shavuos, I'll answer the question myself. But you all know what the answer is, and the answer is that's in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress should not have the right to create an established religion, and Congress does not have the right to prohibit religious thinking and religious expression. That's John Locke. And something else. Not only has God given us reason and the ability to choose how to approach him, God has done something else. He's given us the right to have private property. And what does Locke say? You know what the most important private property an individual has? His own body and his own mind. Nobody has the right to exploit the labor of anybody else, because that's taking away somebody's property. And what goes out the window? The idea of slavery. And in one of those incredible reverses in history, the government or the country that was most responsible for the slave trade was Great Britain. It's British ships that brought over more slaves than anybody else, but in the end, it's not any statement made by an American president that ends the international slave trade. It's a British prime minister that ends the slave trade, and it's the Royal Navy, not the American Navy, that enforces the end of the slave trade. So the greatest slave trading nation is now the nation that is going to abrogate the international slave trade, and that is a consequence of John Locke. I doubt that there's any philosopher in modern history that has had such an impact upon American society as John Locke. This is one of the greatest thinkers of the period, and our country is very, very much beneficial to what he had done. Now I move to the President of the United States, our first president, the father of our country, George Washington. Washington was a slave owner. Now, this shows you how complex human behavior can be. But the dichotomy was there. Whether because the Jews were white, whatever it may be, George Washington was a friend of ours. George Washington was a child of the Enlightenment. And he also was familiar with the Bible. Now, what do I mean by all of this? Is that you all know, if you haven't been there and you go to Rhode Island, make sure you go and take the kids and the grandkids to the Touro Synagogue. In 1790, people from the Touro Synagogue wrote to George Washington congratulating him on being elected President of the United States. And Washington, using the same language that was in the letter addressed to him, wrote and talked about the place of Jews in American society. And he assured them. What is that famous statement, remember? What is it? To bigotry, no sanction, and to persecution, no assistance. And then, again, for those of you who are familiar with the prophets, he actually places in there, if you read one of the last prophets, Micah, it's chapter 4, verse 4, in which Micah says, the day will come when every man will sit under the fig tree and will worship God in the way he wants to worship God. Something to that effect. And that's what George Washington says. George Washington says, he actually quotes Micah. He doesn't say it, but he said, the day we will all, in America, in the United States, every person will sit under the fig tree and under the grapevine and worship God in whichever way he wishes. That's powerful stuff. And it is important. We now know, you don't have to be a political science professor to understand, that American presidents have enormous influence. That's why we Jews are always very concerned when an American president or a high-ranking American official says something bad about the Jews or says something bad about Israel. Large numbers of Americans follow what the president says, even if they're in the opposite party. And so a president has enormous influence. The fact that the father of our country, the great hero, the man that won the Revolutionary War, stated unequivocally and blatantly that the Jews have a place in the United States, that they will be like everybody else in the United States, I'm telling you, has absolutely enormous influence. It's not the most decisive factor, but it is important. There are other reasons as to why we have done very well in American society. One is, if you want to begin at the beginning, American Jews, there weren't many of them, probably between 2,500 and 3,000. American Jews fought in the American Revolution, and nearly all of them supported Washington and the revolutionary cause. No one could ever say in our country, the Jews stabbed us in the back, the Jews sat out the war. All of these charges that will be leveled against our co-religionists in Europe, they will not appear here. And that's because our ancestors, or let us say those people who were here at the time, did by and large fight for the revolution. In addition to that, what's the old song? You'll never hear me sing the refrain. The land was sweet and good, and we did what we could. America is enormously wealthy. And once again, you can't make it in the Northeast, you go to the Ohio Valley. You can't make it in the Ohio Valley, you go to other parts in the Midwest. You can't make it in the Midwest, you go to California, and you go to the Pacific Northwest. There's room for everybody here. There's not that competition for land, not that competition for university places, not that competition for the professions. That's a decisive factor. And then we come to something else. It's related to the fact that we are white, and that is important in American society. Our compatriots are good people, but they weren't always good people. The great disgrace of our country is, of course, slavery and segregation. It is something that our country will never, never live down. But it means in a Jewish context, it means that when our compatriots hate, they hate mostly, by and large, on the basis of race, not on the basis of religion. To put it another way, in a more picturesque way, we American Jews, or Jewish Americans, whatever language you want to use, have been shielded by a black, Latino, and Asian umbrella. When our compatriots hate on the basis of race, that's where they focus their attention, not so much on the Jews, by virtue of the fact that we are white. If you want to get a good example of this, if you are familiar with the history of Jews in the American South, you get a good example of this. Different in religion, different in customs, yet the American South, by and large, accepted thousands of Jews. And the instance, there was anti-Semitism there, but Jews in the South were really treated, if not equals, almost as equals. And if you want a better example of that, when the real crunch comes in the Civil War, who was the vice president of the Confederacy? Judah P. Benjamin. A highly assimilated Jew, but a Jew nonetheless. It is true by 1865, when the fortunes of the Confederacy were declining precipitously, anti-Semitism began to appear, and what happened is some people focused their attention on Judah P. Benjamin. So these are the reasons, but once again, forgive me for repeating myself, the fact that George Washington made it clear that the Jews have a place, an equal place here, that's important. Which leads me into a discussion of probably the most important book in all of American history, never won for great literature, it wasn't. I'm talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin did something that had not been done before. If you remember your high school and college American history classes, what were the issues of the day? States' rights. Where should the preponderance of power be, with the federal government or with the states? Does religion condone slavery? And I must tell you, the outstanding rabbi in the United States at that period of time, who received the salary, the largest salary that any clergyman in the United States got at that time, $3,000 a year he was getting. He said the Bible did in fact approve of slavery. It was a rabbi, a recently immigrated German Jew, Rabbi Einhorn, in Baltimore, who said that that is not the case. The Bible does not agree with slavery. He had to sneak out of Baltimore in the middle of the night because people were coming to lynch him. So the point in all of this is that was with the issues of the day. Another issue of the day, is it really true that blacks are mentally and morally inferior? And the Southern, remember, response was yes, and that's why there has to be slavery, because we have to teach them how to be civilized. Was that true or not? That was one of the arguments at the time. What Harriet Beecher Stowe did in 1862 was not to appeal to the intellect, not to decide all these issues on the basis of science or pseudoscience, but to show you how brutal slavery was, how absolutely brutal. that people were beaten, people were branded, there were amputations and things like that. Families were split up. She showed the American people in that book, which eventually sold within 2 years 300,000 copies. At that period of time, an enormous number of copies. She showed the American people what in fact was happening in the South in a physical sense, in a moral sense, what was happening to blacks. Next week, or somewhere before this course is over, before the lecture series is over, I'll tell you about a Jewish book that is written. Again, not great literature, but what had an enormous impact upon American Jews and American society. No one in his right mind, and again, I'm not being condescending here, would ever call Leon Uris a great writer. But that book, Exodus, had an enormous impact upon American Jewish opinion and upon American public opinion. That we'll talk about in another time. So here's Harriet Beecher Stowe. Did Abraham Lincoln really say to her what everybody taught us? That is, he met her sometime in the midst of the Civil War and said, "So you're the little lady that started this great war?" That's probably a Bubamaitza. There's no evidence that he really ever said that. But there's no question that this is the absolute abolitionist tract. This is the one that turns American public opinion in the North against slavery. This is really very, very significant stuff. Now, where things get a little nasty here is that she wrote another book, The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which she talked about slaveholding, and she mentioned a family in Virginia, the Davis family, a Jewish family. She focused on them and said that they were great slave owners. That's not true. The Davis family were slave owners. There were Jews that owned slaves, and they were slave traders. The Davises were slave traders. But they were small fry. It was not the Jews that were the big people, the big fish in the slave trade. It was the Gentiles who were. And it really is something that charge has haunted us for quite some period of time. And of course, once again, people like Reverend Farrakhan have argued, indeed, it was the Jews in the slave trade, really very, very significant. That is not true. An interesting Jewish sidelight to all of this, believe it or not, two titans of the Zionist movement were very much influenced by Uncle Tom's Cabin. Both men read Uncle Tom's Cabin in Hebrew, and they were both affected by it. One was David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion read Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Hebrew translation, and he was appalled by it, and more than that, remember the Marxist background that he came from, or the socialist background that he came from, he identified slavery with capitalism, and it reinforced his socialist and his Marxist instincts. The other man was a man that Ben-Gurion hated, and a man who probably didn't have much to say well about Ben-Gurion. This is the most controversial Zionist of them all, and that is, if you like him, he's a Jew's Jew, a Jew with pride, a Jew with dignity, a Jew who was a great prophet, and if you didn't like him, forgive me for using this word, he was a fascist bastard, a disgrace to the Jewish people. This is, again, the most controversial Zionist in all of history. That is Vladimir or Zev Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionist movement. And what was the slogan of the revisionist movement? Hadar, dignity. You must always have dignity, and you must be able to fight. You must learn to fight. In 1933 or 34, Jabotinsky wrote a letter to the American Jewish community. And you know what he said? Get guns and learn how to fight. That comes, to a certain extent, from Uncle Tom's Cabin. But primarily it comes from living in Russia and moving around Eastern Europe. So Uncle Tom's Cabin is really very important for American society, and even, you could argue, for the history of our people. And then we come to another book, linked to it. That's the book Roots by Alex Haley. Before I get into that, you see how history turns. You see how it evolves. And when she wrote that book in the 1850s, everyone had sympathy for Uncle Tom, right? They beat him to death. Everybody had it. But you know what I know. Uncle Tom is a synonym for cowardice, right? Any black leader who doesn't show sufficient backbone or seems to be pandering to the whites, he's an Uncle Tom. The character Uncle Tom in that book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, has not fared well with the passing of time. In the 1850s and 60s and 70s, he's a hero, a martyr. Today, his name becomes an epithet, in fact, for cowardice and for, let us say, not incompetence, but for cowardice and a failure to stand up in defense of his people. Things change. Another book is the book Roots by Alex Haley. The book is a fairly good one, and remember we all saw the miniseries. 100 million people saw that miniseries. No miniseries had as many people there. And when he was asked, is it true or is it fiction? It was a myth. He said it was both. But what was important now I'm watching my language very carefully. Harriet Beecher Stowe showed, again, the beating of people and so on. That was terrible. All that stuff I told you about. The selling of children away from their mothers and fathers, the splitting up of marriages, and all that stuff. What you did not get in Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably because we're talking about the Victorian period, was the sexual exploitation that took place in slavery. We still don't talk to our students about that, certainly not at the high school level. Again, I'm not being flippant here. If a slave owner wanted a roll in the hay with any woman or girl on that plantation, he would have her. Didn't make any difference whether she was married or not, whether she had children, no matter what her age was. The sexual exploitation was absolutely tremendous. And there was something else, and that is the first part of the book. He thinks, or he supposes, or he presupposes, he's tracing his ancestors. This is the first, I wouldn't say accurate, probably by and large accurate, description of that infamous passage known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage. That is, the first part of the passage is, Europeans bring goods to sell to African tribal leaders. Now here's the stuff that people don't like to talk about. The slave trade could not have taken place unless it had the collaboration of African tribal leaders. African tribes were making war against each other, and they took slaves. In exchange for guns and alcohol and whatever trinkets the people could bring from England and France, they gave them slaves. And when they got this, the slaves coming to the Caribbean and to other parts of the Western Hemisphere, that's the Middle Passage. And if you saw that Spielberg film that dealt with the slave trade, you saw what happened. Again, if the crew, the white crew, wanted to have sex with any of the people who were in chains, he would have his way with these African women. And then that most telling part of the picture of the film was that they took so many slaves, they never had enough food to feed them. So what they would do, they would chain them together and throw them overboard. The Middle Passage was brutal. We believe, again, the absolute number of slaves that were brought to our country is probably somewhere between, not to our country, to the Western Hemisphere, is probably between 14 and 16 million people. Most historians would argue that at least 25% of the slaves that were taken in Africa and brought to the Western Hemisphere died in the Middle Passage. So that's what Roots showed us. It showed us the Middle Passage, and it showed us a number of other things. It showed us the sexual exploitation. The problem with the book was he never finished it. He never finished the book. An editor had to finish it, and that was a problem. And he never really answered the question. It really is fiction. But it tells you something else. It's based on something that minority groups often have to resort to, especially when they are not allowed to read and to write. What is important from the historical point of view is the oral tradition. It's the oral tradition. That's where he gets his stories. Over the centuries, people passed down stories. In our time, not in our time, but there was a time in our history when life was difficult. People were either illiterate, people didn't know how to read and write. The tradition, the religious tradition, is passed down orally. And then at a later period of time, it is codified and put on parchment or put on paper. So roots is an important thing. The fact that 100 million people saw it really, again, will reinforce the hostility towards slavery and the hostility towards segregation. And then in line with that, another book, and that is a book that I'm sure none of you have read. Historians read it because it is important in 20th century American history. That's a book by a man by the name of Madison Grant. Madison Grant was a sociologist. He was a eugenicist as well. And the title of the book is The Passing of the Great Race. Now, to cut to the chase right away, he's asking a question. What made America great? And the answer, he said, was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That's what made America great. And what is making America enter into a period of decline is, he doesn't use that expression, but people who read him use it, the mongrelization of the white race. Why is our country about to embark upon a period of decline? Because inferior people are coming to our country. Italians, Slavs, Jews, black people, and Asians. They are coming to our country. They are intermarrying with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They are diluting the blood pool, the gene pool, and the country is about to go to the dogs. Don't laugh at that statement. Don't laugh at it. That idea, that's going to lead to something in the post-World War I period that has enormous implications for the history of the Jewish people. It is as a result of books like that and feelings like that that in 1924, the United States, for the first time in its history, passes legislation limiting immigration into our country. That's the Jackson-Reed Law. The Jackson-Reed Law is the first important law in 1924, limiting not only quantitatively, but qualitatively, the number of people that come into our country. In its original numbers, keep this in mind, before World War I, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people were coming into our country each year. As a result of Jackson-Reed, the total number of people coming in, that figure will be slowly increased, but for a number of years, it's 168,000. So from literally, or nearly literally, open immigration, we are going to restrict immigration into our country quantitatively, but also qualitatively. We don't want the Japanese. We don't want the Chinese. We don't want people in Eastern Europe. And the reason for that is, if you remember your American history, this is the time of the first Red Scare. The commies are coming. The Russians are coming. And how do we know that all these people coming from Eastern Europe, how do we know that some of them are really not communists? And that's going to be a very important step. We don't want Italians here. We don't want Italians. Either they're fascists or they're communists. We don't want them into the country. Who do we want? We want the Irish, excuse me. We want the Anglo-Saxons. We want even the old enemy. We want the Germans. We want the Scandinavians. We do not want those people that I mentioned to you about. Why is this important in Jewish history? Why are thinking of Madison Grant, excuse me, why is it important? And the answer is that large numbers of Jews who want to come to our country and cannot come to our country, to use that proverbial expression of some Holocaust survivors, they will go up the chimney. Remember, that's the difference between being a Jew and a non-Jew in Europe. If you're non-Jewish, if you're not a Jew, and you want to come to our country, and you can't get in, and you decide to stay in Europe, life will be hard for you. But you will not die. Because under the Nazis, if you kept your mouth shut, that's the difference between communist oppression and Nazi oppression. Under the Nazis, if you were not Jewish, not a gypsy, not a Jehovah's Witness, not a gay or a lesbian, if you were just an ordinary, conventional citizen and you kept your mouth shut, you stood a very good chance of surviving the war. But if you were Jewish, again, Himmler's famous remark, some of you may not know it, writing to SS commanders in the Ukraine, quote, we must kill, he's talking about the Jews, we must kill them down to the last child in the cradle, end quote. But if you're not Jewish, under the communists, it's different. The communists would pick you out arbitrarily. If you were religious, you owned a property, you belonged to a political party, you're off to Siberia if you're lucky, you entered into Lubyanka, the great prison in Moscow, if you're unlucky. So the other thing where you can argue in a beneficial sense, believe it or not, there's a beneficial aspect to Jackson Reed. If you can't get to the United States, and remember, by the end of the 20s, and especially with the onset of the Depression in 1929, it's very difficult to get anywhere, including our own country. All those countries that were open, they're no longer open. Nobody wants immigrants, and nobody wants Jewish immigrants. And the answer, of course, if you are desperate and you want to get out, is you go to Palestine. In fact, I'm making a statement to you which may seem very, very strange, and that is, if not for Jackson Reed, there might not have been a state of Israel. Because by 1939 and 40, there were 450,000 Jews in Palestine, a minority, but the critical mass was there. Without Jackson Reed, 95% of all those Polish Jews who wanted to flee Poland in the interwar period would have come to the United States. But they go, large numbers of them go to Palestine. And they make in Palestine the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in Palestine, a concrete and irrevocable reality. So Jackson Reed really has an influence really almost counterintuitive. So these are some of the books that have an influence on American society. I'll leave the discussion of Betty Friedan for after the question and answer period. Hold on, Margaret, hold on, we'll get there. Won't get there too much, but we'll get there. And that is another book that was an inspiration for American Jews and American Gentiles. You're going to laugh when I tell you the books written by Horatio Alger, they are for sure not great literature. That is the surest thing. No one would doubt me on that. Do you know who I'm talking about? Do you know what his novels are about? The first one is Raggedy Dick. Raggedy Dick is a poor boy who shines shoes for a living. But Raggedy Dick has got guts, he works very hard, he's as honest as the day is long, and he becomes a multi-millionaire. It's Horatio Alger that creates the idea of the American dream and inspires large numbers of Americans, Gentiles and Jews, to believe in the American dream, to believe that social mobility is a real fact of life. And you know who's the ultimate model? The ultimate Horatio Alger person? It's Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, who was born in Scotland, shoveled dung on the farm, comes to the United States, and becomes one of the richest Americans. So Horatio Alger is also very important. Now, let's take a break. We'll come back. I'll talk a little bit about Betty Friedan. I know my limitations, and I know to whom I'm speaking here. So I will deal with that, and then we will have some questions, and then we'll call it a night. Please take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back. Thank you. Could I get some, please? That would be nice. Thank you. Thanks for coming. All right, my friends, we should begin. How are you doing now? Two guys from 71. Stephen Levitt and Peter Levine. He moved back here. Clifton Park, he's a pediatrician, retired pediatrician. Excuse me. Yes, sir. Yeah? You know, I don't remember the name. My wife is here. Maybe she's remembered, but we'll call Natalie tonight. Susan Sugarman, from here or from Albany? Clifton Park. From Clifton Park. Yeah, I think Natalie is president of the chapter here. That's right. Right, Natalie is in Mahwah, Jersey. That's right over the border. Right over the border. Thank you. Susan Sugarman? Susan Sugarman. We'll talk to Natalie tonight. Take care. Stay in touch. All right, my friends, we're going to begin. 2-minute warning. 2-minute warning. Time to wake up. All right, my friends. We're going to talk a little bit about Betty Friedan. Now, the day will come when there will be, it may not happen, you know, I'm a fossil, so it may not come in my time, but it very well may come in my time, we will have a woman president. And if that happens, Betty Friedan had played a role in that. But if you don't like to read, seriously, some people, they don't have the Sitzfleisch, don't have the patience, I tell you what you do, if you want to know about Betty Friedan. Go and see the film Barbie. Barbie is Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan, that's the argument against the patriarchy. But to be more precise, the book, The Feminine Mystique, was written in the year 1963. There's a time and a place for everything. Again, the first wave of feminine emancipation was with the suffrage movement. And in 1919, when women were given the right to vote, that's the first wave of the women's movement. Betty Friedan starts the second wave. And what she's talking about, and she's right, I mean, you don't have to be a rabid feminist to believe that, but she's absolutely right. During the Second World War, with manpower shortages reaching the way they were, in December of 1944, the draft call in our country was 500,000 men a month. I mean, again, not everybody was mobilized in our country, but there was a manpower shortage. Women filled the gap, as they had done in World War I. They worked in the factories, you know, Rosie the Riveter and all that kind of stuff. But when the war came to an end, many women were thrown out of work. You got to provide jobs for the demobilized soldiers. And that caused a great deal of resentment, and she addressed herself to that, and among other things. And what she said, what she had done, she graduated from Smith College. Years later, in 1957, she sent around a questionnaire to 200 alumni of Smith. And she asked them how they felt about themselves. And the answer was very discouraging. They felt worthless, their lives were unfulfilled, they were unhappy campers. And she began to investigate why. And she said what came to be, and again, I think no one could deny these things, is that some very gifted women, and some didn't have to be a gifted woman, really didn't have lives that could be fulfilling. There was the cult of domesticity. That is, again, the Germans, of course, who do it more aggressively than anybody else and did it right, and in term not did it right, but they cut to the chase very well. The German expression is a woman's place in the Küche mit den Kindern in der Kirche. A woman's place in the kitchen with the children and in the church. And that is what she was getting from these women. She said, we have no lives. Everything is tied up with our husbands. The only glory that we get, the only prestige, the only status that we get is through our husbands. And what is our job? To make more children and to nurture these children. But what about us? What about the women? We want to do other things. We are not stupid people. We're as gifted as the men. We should be able to do these things. That is what she addressed. That's the feminist mystique. And very shortly thereafter, she created the organization. She's a co-founder of the organization now, National Organization of Women. And rallies were held, and she argued that women should go into politics, and she tried to bridge what men have to face. She tried to get the same thing, and I tell you, it's not an easy thing for men, and it certainly is not an easy thing for women. I see it in my own colleagues, and I see it in people who are very, very distinguished. How do you be good at what you do and be a good spouse? It's not easy to bridge that. It's not easy to do the two things. And she said, we can do it. And massive rallies, women in politics. She had a close relationship with a woman that only the older people remember. Remember Bella Abzug? Again, the congresswoman from Manhattan. Again, what she was talking about, and she correctly understood, we will not be able to change the position of women in American society unless we enter into the realm of politics. That's why I said to you that, again, when we have a woman president, again, you can thank Betty Friedan for that. She's the one that mobilized women, gave them an idea that they didn't have to buy into the feminist mystique. That is, the role of a woman is to be a caretaker and a good spouse, a baby maker and a domestic worker. That's Betty Friedan. Now, she ran into trouble a little bit later on for a number of reasons. She really did not say some nice things about lesbians. We're all flesh and blood. People made a mistake. She didn't say so much. She retracted them later on, but the damage was done. And she thought, and now here this is a matter of debate, she thought that the feminist movement was going off the rails. She thought that some of the people who followed her were talking about, or in effect saying, to hell with the family, it's our time now, our time to enter politics, our time to enter the sciences, and so on. Again, when a group is aggrieved, sometimes you get a terrible radical extremist response. And I must tell you, and I'm not a radical feminist, the fact of the matter is, if you've got a decent bone in your body, have a brain in your head, you know that women have suffered a great deal. Some of you may have seen the article in the New York Times that appeared, I think, a day or two, 2 days ago, about Lisa Meitner. Lisa Meitner is one of the 20th century's greatest physicists. She was the collaborator with Otto Hahn. Otto Hahn, in 1939, split the atom, the roots of the atomic bomb, in what this German chemist did. Well, the woman who worked aside of him was Lisa Meitner. She was Jewish. He protected her in Nazi Germany until it became too hot for her, and she went to Sweden. This woman was nominated 46 times for the Nobel Prize and never got it. Never got it. I'm not a physicist, I'm not a chemist, but the ones that I know, and from what I've read from others who are very distinguished, she was every inch the equal of Otto Hahn. Every inch the equal of Otto Hahn. Now, when he got it in 1944, but he took it after the war. And when he went to Sweden, what happened was, again, he made reference to her. I'm not sure he mentioned her by name, but if he did, whether he mentioned her by name or not, he referred to her as my assistant. She was not his assistant. She was his collaborator. He was a chemist. He didn't know some of this stuff. Only she could do this. And also something else. She had a very, very smart nephew. He too was nominated for the Nobel Prize. And he too did not get it. So she had the proverbial two strikes against her. One, she was a woman, and the other was that she was a Jewish woman. So the important point in everything that I said this evening is I drum into my students that personality counts in history. Towering personalities, men and women, changed the course of history. And I tell them, can anyone deny that the 20th century was not tremendously influenced by 6 men? Mao, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Can anybody deny that? And the answer is no. Towering personalities change the course of history. But so too do ideas. Ideas are important. And when I spoke to you in the beginning about John Locke, I gave you what I thought was the quintessential example. All of the people that I talk about were not great historical actors or activists. They really weren't. It's their ideas that changed history. Unfortunately, in history, it is not only the good ideas that affect the way people feel and influence their political behavior. Sometimes there can be some terrible ideas. When I talk about anti-Semitism, I will talk about ideas of anti-Semitism that have no validity, either in moral thinking or in logic. Nonetheless, these people are going to adhere to those ideas which were most unfortunate. So important are ideas in history, and I'll come back to this in another lecture. So important are ideas in history that what often happens, men will kill and they will rape in the name of ideas. They will sacrifice and fight to the death in the name of ideas. And if you want an example of American history, a good example of American history, in the summer of 1964, that's the Mississippi summer, when 1,000 young men and women, nearly all of them from the North, went down south and helped blacks in Mississippi register for the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, helped them vote, taught them stuff. 50% of the physicians who went south were Jewish. 60% of the attorneys who went south were Jewish. It's a good chapter, a glorious chapter in American history. They did not go down there because it was worth their while economically to go down there. They went because it was wrong what was being done in the South. Civil rights elicited a response from people, whites as well as black, because it was the right thing to do. And as I tell my students, sometimes ideas are so important that they bring about not only the unfortunate circumstances that I talked about. Of all the ideas in modern history, the most powerful of them all is the idea of nationalism. Nationalism is more important than class. Ask, as the socialist movement would come to understand, ask a man to choose between his class solidarity with the international proletariat and his loyalty to his country, proletarian solidarity goes out the window. Ask a man to choose between his God and his nation, don't bet on God. Ask a man to choose between his wife and his nation, or a woman to choose between her husband and a nation, don't bet on the marriage. In the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, where pressure was brought upon people for whatever the reason may be to divorce their spouses, many people did just that. So, personality is important in history, ideas are important in history. Next week we'll talk about more of them. Are there any questions now? He's asking the question, is Uncle Tom's, with all the book banning that people are talking about, I haven't read that Uncle Tom's Cabinet has been. Now, you got to be careful here. On the one hand, you get the right-wing lunatics who don't like Uncle Tom's Cabin because it makes whites look bad and so on. Incidentally, I should have mentioned this before, Uncle Tom's Cabin will be interpreted as a feminist tract. because all of the women who appear, even the wife of the slaveholder, is portrayed very, very well. And there's little Eva. All the women in Uncle Tom's Cabin are portrayed very, very well. And that's going to be an inspiration to some people later on in the feminist movement. From the left comes the argument that you cannot use books like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, because they use the language of the times, they use the word nigger. So in some places, it's the left that has asked for those books to be removed. It's not only the right that talks about, although in our time, right now, it's the right wing that talks about banning books. But in answer, direct answer to your question, I may be wrong on this. I have not read or heard of the banning of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It wouldn't surprise me if it was the case, but I have not heard it. Any other questions on anything that we have covered? Yes?
You mentioned a rabbi that said that slavery was okay, and I'm assuming the reason he said that was because of the laws about slavery.
In the Bible. That's right.
Did he also mention that the laws in Leviticus are a lot more humanitarian about slavery than the laws?
Yes, the rabbi is in the back here. I will address myself. You can make the case. Again, some people make the opposite case. That those laws concerning slavery in the Bible apply only to Jewish Hebrew slaves? The leniency, the releasing with money and so on, and all that type. Does that only apply to Hebrew slaves, or does it apply to Gentile slaves? Now, again, the prevailing opinion among Jewish clergymen was slavery was an evil institution, it had to be done away with. And there was a man who was not a rabbi. Nobody knows this man anymore. He's one of the great humanists at the end of the 19th century. That's Michael Halperin. Halperin was a supporter of Russian Jewish immigration when they came to this country, and he was a vehement anti-slavery proponent. Any other questions, my friends? Yes, go ahead.
So, like, this thing we're having to do with what you said.
I'm sorry. Let me come over this so I can read it better. Go ahead.
So, can you, like, like, recommend, like, some, like, primary sources of, like, like, prohibition? I can't really find much.
All right. First, it's slavery. Read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Don't wait for people like me to tell you about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Read Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's a primary source. And you can get statements about prohibition by a general American history book. Any good general American history book will give you statements, primary sources about prohibition. I must tell you, now, generally speaking here, let me say to you, what strengthens prohibition, or the call for prohibition, is World War I. There were always people that said it's the devil's work and all that kind of stuff. In World War I, the argument was that soldiers were there were so many alcoholics among soldiers, they could not perform well on the battlefield. And that people working in the factories were so inebriated, they could not fulfill the quotas. That's where the real impetus comes. It's always there, the religious argument against a temperance movement, but what really gives it great strength is World War I. But once again, I'm not dodging your question. Any general history will give you primary sources on prohibition. Any other questions, Mark? Yes?
My city of Washington's slaveholding came acquired for the wife's family.
Yeah, when in trouble, you blame the woman, right? Yeah, but what was damaging to his reputation is that some historian found a document in which a slave had escaped, and it wasn't from his plantation, but from another plantation, and he participated in the posse that caught that slave. That raises a very interesting question. How do you look at people, can you divorce people from the time in which they are in? We Jews face that problem because some very famous people hated Jews. You know who's the leading theoretician in the medieval period? against the Jews was a man, he's the greatest Catholic theologian of the medieval period. That's Thomas Aquinas. There are churches that are named after Thomas Aquinas. Are we going to cancel them out? It's a problem. Everyone has their flaws, and historical figures have their flaws. When I teach the course in World War II, I tell who saved England? Winston Churchill saved England. Winston Churchill was a great man. He led England in its finest hour. When people in England wanted to throw in the towel, when no one else was fighting against the Nazis, he kept England afloat. He kept telling the British people, we have to stay in there. This is the incarnation of evil with the Nazis, or what the Nazis are, and eventually we will win, because he always believed correctly that the United States would eventually come into the war. But when you talk Winston Churchill to an Irishman, you won't get accolades there. And above all, if you talk about Winston Churchill to somebody from the Indian subcontinent, they'll spit in your face. He was a racist, an absolute racist. He hated the Indians. He even hated a man that nobody else could hate. How could you hate Gandhi? He hated Gandhi. And you spoke out against Gandhi. I may have said this to you before. It is, of course, conventional to argue that he was in the wilderness in the 1930s. His great strength was that he was among the first of the English people, of English politicians, to speak out and warn against Adolf Hitler. That was it. But nobody listened to him. That's not because they were pro-Nazi. How could you take a guy seriously who spoke against Gandhi? I'm not joking here. This is a real issue here. We are all flawed people. It's as simple as that. So you are right. Whether it's his wife, he maintained the plantation, and he benefited from the plantation, and he went out hunting slave fugitives. But when it came to our country, without him, there may not be any United States. And that marvelous statement about, again, to bigotry, sanction, and to persecution, no assistance, and sit under the fig tree in the vineyard, that's important stuff. We're all flawed. Any other questions, my friends? Anything at all? Well, hold on. Yes, Rabbi. Rabbi, did you want to say something? You want to ask something?
My question was just, if you could point us, what were the greatest hits of American literature that you didn't mention in your lecture? Like 3 or 4, the next 3 or 4, and in one sentence, what their influence was.
Rabbi, I'm not a professor of American literature. There are many, many great works in American literature. And, as we all know, Jews are well represented there, certainly in the 20th century. The books by Philip Roth, the books by Bernard Malamud, they just make some of these absolutely magnificent books. And then there are some novels at the end of the 19th. We all read Red Badge of Courage. We all read that in high school. And again, A Tale of Two Cities, not American literature, but English literature. These are, and actually the other book, If Uncle Tom's Cabin was not the great anti-slavery tract, it's the one that was written by the man who, remember, from Saratoga, who was caught in Saratoga. That's Solomon Northrop. There were many, many books written by former slaves who had come out with the Underground Railroad. Here's a point of trivia for you. Where's the last stop on the Underground Railroad? The last stop.
Syracuse.
Where?
Syracuse.
I can't hear.
Syracuse.
Oh, you know where it is? Nova Scotia. That's why to this day there's a fairly large African-American community in Nova Scotia. All right. Any other questions on anything we have discussed? Now, excuse me, Amy. John Locke. You can read John Locke. If you want the primary source, you can read his essay on toleration. It's more than toleration. Other people spoke about toleration. You got to allow them to do what they want. Locke said the right of religious freedom is an inalienable right. It's more than toleration. It's part of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And part of the pursuit of happiness is, in fact, the right to reach God in the way that you want. Yes, and did you want to say something? Yes, I'll answer with one question and we'll call it a night.
Do you think Russian literature had a big influence on like Jewish, like the Jews in American history?
All right, he's asking a question about Russian literature. Now, I must tell you, don't get upset when I'm going to tell you. Hang on to this one. Hang on to this one. Ready for me now? I tell the students, you cannot consider yourself an educated person unless you have read War and Peace by Tolstoy. This is probably the greatest work of literature in the modern period. So Russian literature is terribly important. It affects the Jews in a way that's very interesting. When Jews live in a country where they're a minority, they always identify with the dominant group. That's a survival technique of the Jews. If you live in an area where the Germans and Poles are living, you speak German. In Prague, where there are Czechs and Germans and Jews, if you're Jewish, you go to the German section of the Charles University. Many Russian Jews were so enraptured, they were captured by the brilliance of Russian literature that, and this is a problem down into our time, where's the place in that part of the Russian Empire where Jews lived side by side with other people? Well, almost everywhere. In the Ukraine, it's Jews living among Ukrainians and Russians. What language should Jews speak and read? It's Russian. And so in the eyes of Ukrainians, the Jews are Russophiles. They're Russophiles and they're Russifiers. And that's one of the reasons for the anti-Semitism, one of the reasons for the anti-Semitism in Ukraine. When I talk to you about Tolstoy, I'm not doing justice here. I mean, the golden age of Russian literature is Tolstoy, right? Turgenev, right? Dostoevsky. There's no country that has literature that matches that. And so, you're in the 7th grade. Not yet time for you to read these things. But the one that you might like, that's probably would be Fathers and Sons, or it's sometimes translated as Fathers and Children, by Turgenev. That you probably can handle. The other stuff, I have trouble handling. All right, that's it. All right, Amy, let me just pick up this stuff here. Thank you all for coming. This is ceremonial celebration. Let me put this here.